Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Network 2020's briefing about how to provide humanitarian aid to Gaza. For those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Courtney Doggart. I am the president of Network 2020, which is a New York City-based nonprofit that provides access to leading thinkers and doers in international affairs. We have audiences both here in New York in person as well as around the world, and we're really trying to create more nuanced conversations about key events in global affairs. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to the topic. So I think over the weekend, the news, as often does, sort of outpaces our planning, and people's attention has shifted, I think, to this very tense tit-for-tat ratcheting up of conflict between Israel and Iran. But there are still more than 1 million people in Gaza who are on the brink of starvation and famine, which the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, which is a multi-stakeholder analysis with over a decade of use, stated was likely between mid-March and May 2024. And USAID Administrator Samantha Power confirmed this assessment last week, saying that it was credible that famine may have already begun. And so making sense of this conflict, I think, is often an incredibly complex undertaking where one has to hold generations of pain and suffering alongside a whole knot of technical agreements and political developments. But what I think in this case that everyone can agree on, I hope, is that looming famine and the need for urgent humanitarian aid is not complex. It is, I believe, a moral imperative. And so our challenge today is to try to understand why this seemingly simple solution of providing aid is proving so elusive and what can be done to change the course of this human-made humanitarian catastrophe. So we have invited 3 experts today to help us understand this issue from several perspectives. First, we have Amar Hamzawy. He is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Carnegie Middle East Program. He focuses on governance in the Middle East and North Africa, social vulnerability, and the different roles of government and civil society in the region. We hope he can help us understand the roles that various regional stakeholders are playing in alleviating this situation. Next, we have Dave Harden. Dave is the Managing Director of the Georgetown Strategy Group, which works with the private sector, local communities, and governments to, among other things, facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance in the Middle East and Africa. This follows a long career in the Foreign Service and at USAID, where he served as Assistant Administrator for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. He can give us an on-the-ground look at what it takes to provide humanitarian aid, including from the US government perspective. Lastly, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Thomas Weiss. Professor Weiss is a distinguished scholar of international relations and global governance with the special expertise in the politics of the United Nations. He is the presidential professor at the Graduate Center CUNY and is director emeritus of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies. He is one of the leading experts on the theory and practice of humanitarian intervention, and he is also the author of Humanitarianism Contested, a title that was so evocative that it unknowingly stuck in our heads and influenced our title for this event, so all credit goes to Professor Weiss. His expertise on humanitarian intervention, the role of the UN, and his work in helping to popularize the concept of responsibility to protect is why we are very pleased that he could join our panel. So with that, we'll get to the discussion. Dave, starting with you, it has now been more than 6 months into a war that has had a dire humanitarian toll and an unprecedented toll on aid workers. You built your career in conflict and humanitarian crisis. How would you describe the situation of humanitarian aid in this conflict, and how does it compare to what you have seen historically? You are muted.
You would think after 4 years of this, we would get that straight. But thank you, Courtney. Thank you for having me here. And I believe that your colleague's going to put up a map of Gaza. And one other element in this in this conversation. I was actually the USAID mission director, and prior to that, the deputy mission director for the West Bank and Gaza. So I ran all responses in the 2008-9 chaos-led war, and then in 2014. So look, we have, I think Samantha Power laid it out. We have a very fast onset humanitarian crisis. It's completely manufactured. I think everybody understands that. There's only one way to blunt first the famine, either the current famine or famine risk, and to begin to stabilize both the economy and the humanitarian situation more broadly, and that is the land crossings. Full stop. I'm just going to speak a moment about airdrops. They're inefficient. They're expensive. They don't target the most vulnerable. They can create chaos and conflict. Those who get the airdrops usually are the fastest, strongest, and most connected. So, airdrops are the last thing that you do. And if you do, then you organize it with some folks on the ground. None of that is happening. Airdrops, bad idea. It just makes folks feel good. Slight caveat is I would probably agree that like Jordan and Morocco can do airdrops, but the US, it's a waste of time and money. The port, real quick. So I actually like the port. The port's not going to solve today's problem. And we do need to get a maritime channel in there. But Gaza's never had a functional port. The Israelis control the maritime zone. And so it actually helps create facts on the ground if you can open up a port. But again, that's not going to solve the situation really quickly. At the very north, and just give me a minute when you want me to stop. I know we only have 3 or 4 minutes. It's very detailed, though. In the north is Erez. Erez has only ever been a people crossing. It's now starting to open up for some humanitarian assistance. You can access potentially Ashdod port and bring in a lot there. The Kerem Shalom is down in the very bottom corner. That's at the corner of Egypt, Israel, and Gaza. What we have is along that whole perimeter, a bunch of shuttered land crossings that have been shuttered for 15 years. All of those could open. Kerem Shalom could carry all the volume that you want. It had historically since October 17th. Rafah, which is in the news a lot. Rafah had never been open for goods. It is now. That's a good thing. But at the end of the day, what you need is more food, more predictably, more often from more crossings. And the economics of this is to flood the zone so that a basket of food or a kilo of wheat isn't particularly valuable. Right. So from an economics perspective, you want to get enough in there so that it changes the economics of the commodities. And you want to have enough crossings open so that no one crossing is particularly important in case it shuts down in a conflict or it attracts violence or protesters or gets closed for whatever reason. So multiple land entries. With that, I'll stop. I'm sure there are questions.
Yeah, well, one quick follow-up question on that, because this is, very good in terms of the details of in the mechanics of it. In terms of like inspections, because isn't that one of the big hurdles that need to happen as well? Can you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a few things that kind of slow down the situation. So inspections are one of them, and the Israelis have been very, very rigid on what constitutes dual use, and there needs to be a little bit more flexibility. Tent poles, I mean, for displaced people, that could be a dual use item, but it needs to go in. There are certain things like certain sugars. I mean, there's a pretty deep list of what's prohibited, and really you need to almost invert that. So, everything's allowed in, but as opposed to nothing is allowed in, but. The inspection regime really is also quite complicated because not only is it very, very detailed and labor, inducive, you have to unload the trucks, inspect it, reload it up, move it 200 yards through a sterile zone, and then unload it and reload it again to get it to any of the access points. Further, I would say that there's real impediments on kind of the last mile or the last 100 meters on getting food anywhere. And that's actually outside of the Israelis to some extent. That's Hamas, that's rubble, that's chaos, that's violence. But it's also the deconfliction, which has been grossly negligent and was the result of kind of the deconfliction, which allows humanitarian actors to move from point A to point B with safety, has been non-functional. You saw that with the World Central Kitchen hit, and then you just saw this the other day with a Palestinian crew that was trying to get to somebody where they were deconflicted. So I'll stop because I know you have a big audience.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Dave. Tom, taking a different approach, one question that I think many lay observers, including myself, have when looking at a humanitarian catastrophe is, these questions of why can't governments do anything? What is the UN for if it cannot put a stop to this? So how would you describe the role of international bodies like the UN in crisis moments like these? And what are the UN and other governing bodies doing, and what are their limitations?
Well, thanks, Courtney. Dave has been on the ground with dirty fingernails. I'm going to be flying at a slightly higher altitude here to answer your question. So pardon me if I sound like a textbook, because that's what I do. And mine on the UN is in its 9th edition. So, but there are two essential distinctions that I think that we have to start with. That is, what the hell is the UN and what does it do? And the first distinction of what is the UN consists really of two parts: member states that approve resolutions and pay the bills, or sometimes pay the bills, but also a second UN that consists of officials on the payroll, starting with the Secretary General on down. And the second distinction, I think, is between concrete operations, feeding people on the ground, providing tents, et cetera, the kind of thing that Dave has talked about. And the other is about ideas, norms, principles, and standards. And these two things often get mushed together. So on number one, your question about, why the UN can't do anything. What exactly are we speaking about? True, member states don't agree, and in the Security Council at present, they don't agree on anything. Yet the staff of the second UN, which consists, among other things, of the humanitarians on the ground working with NGOs and reporting on what the hell's going on, they are hardly inactive. Moreover, in the past, on occasion, the Security Council has acted, just not now. But in Gaza, we see the usual contemporary situation of U.S. veto on virtually everything, just as we saw in Moscow and Beijing getting in the way of doing anything in Syria or Myanmar. That's the first UN of member states. As I say, this is paralyzed, but we've seen UNRWA, and I think Dave could speak more knowledgeably. I've seen them on a couple of occasions, interviewed a lot of people. But it's doing its utmost in spite of the huge problems, including the political problems about the staff members who were fired as a result of their affinities with Hamas. We can moan about the inaction. I think I just make a sidebar here to, what's not going on in the Ukraine for the same reasons. Security Council is paralyzed, the second UN is not, and certainly Ukrainians would point to UNICEF, the World Food Program, UNHCR, and the list goes on. And I'd say eventually we'll get back to UNRWA in Gaza. For the couple of million people in Gaza and the 5 million elsewhere in the region. And it seems to me, and we can open up a parenthesis later, that the efforts to undermine what UNRWA is and what it does is helpful to the current Netanyahu's regime of trying to basically halt any notion of a right to return by a huge number of people in Palestine. And I should also note that even that hopeless first UN is not totally inactive. 40 member states brought case to the ICC on Putin, and we've seen some deliberations there about Gaza and Israel. And we've seen overwhelming condemnations both of Russia in the General Assembly and of Israel and the US in the General Assembly. Not as many times as yet because the war hasn't lasted, but it's similar sort of level of intensity and numbers of disapprovals. And I'd like to also point out that on occasion, I'd like to just move to Syria for a moment, where that hopeless, helpless Security Council of elected members and permanent members couldn't make a decision to do something on the humanitarian side. When chemical weapons became an issue too far, there was really only one recourse: the UN in collaboration with the Office for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So, and I'd say that undoubtedly, if we get out of the current situation and there's some kind of ceasefire, some kind of return of hostages, we'll be back to having UNRWA in collaboration with a small army of NGOs providing assistance. The other part of the UN, that is the sort of research, norms, principles, and standards, are also important. They have been important in this region as they have been in other parts of the world. And so let me close by saying that the audience and the media is obviously most concerned about the lack of action by the first UN, but today's conversation is about largely the second UN on the ground, I'd say. And the political as well as the on-the-ground UN reflects the strengths and weaknesses of the organization and its founding. Because of the veto and the structure, great powers either agree or nothing happens. But on other occasions, the organizations, that second U of staff, can really make a difference. So to just return to that sort of age-old comment from attributed to Hammarskjöld, that the organization was not created to get us to heaven, but to keep us from hell. So I wrote a book that was called "Would the World Be Better Without the UN?" And since obviously most people in the audience haven't read it, the answer is on page 190. No. Thanks.
Thank you for that distinction. Amr, turning to you, what has been the experience of Egypt as a neighboring country to the war, and one that really played a role and can play a role, I think, in both the ceasefire negotiations, but also in humanitarian relief? And if you could also explain for us why President al-Sisi has refused to open humanitarian corridors for civilians.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Pleasure to join you. A pleasure in a regional horrible situation that did not start in the last weekend. It started back in October, and I dare say that a great deal of the root causes of what we're seeing right now date back to the last decade of ignoring the legitimate right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, to get their independent state, and to get an integral nation state comprised of the West Bank and Gaza, as well as East Jerusalem, an integral state which lives in peace with Israel, of course, but all of the two-state solution premise, which shaped regional diplomacy and international diplomacy vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict up until 2010, 2011, was wiped away, was pushed aside in the last decade, and it resulted in the big disaster we're witnessing since the terrorist attacks of October 7, committed by Hamas on Israel, and the war in Gaza, and the great deal of killing, destruction, bloodshed we're seeing in Gaza since October 8 until today. Let me come back to your question by saying the following: that Egypt looks at Gaza at three different layers that need to be analytically kept in mind to understand why is it that when you say, for example, humanitarian corridors in Egypt, this is a no-go zone, not only for the government, but for the Egyptian public as well. So number one, Gaza from an Egyptian perspective is a national security concern. Historically speaking, this has been a place where Egypt has always had national security concerns since the second half of the 20th century. Egypt, some of you will remember, and some of our attendees will remember, was the administrator of Gaza between 1948 and 1967. Then, following the Six-Day War in June 1967, Gaza became under Israeli occupation. Gaza is in close proximity to the Sinai Peninsula, a key and integral part of the Egyptian territory, with great national security concerns unfolding in recent years in the form of attacks on Egyptian government facilities by radical Islamist groups, by terrorist groups. From a national security perspective, Egypt has always pushed forward two objectives vis-a-vis Gaza. One, to undermine the penetration from Gaza towards Sinai in a way which could aid and did aid previously terrorist groups operating within Egypt. Right now, the terrorism issue is under control from an Egyptian government perspective, from an Egyptian society perspective. And secondly, to, of course, avoid any potential of mass displacement. From a national security perspective, humanitarian corridors in Egypt, and we are, Courtney, I have to remind you and everyone else, we live in a region where refugee camps become a permanent feature of the respective country in which they start. I mean, you cannot refer to a single case where refugee camps in the Middle East and North Africa have been dismantled since the second half of the 20th century. So speaking of humanitarian corridors, or as some people evoked the Ukrainian analogy in the first weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the humanitarian corridors in some Eastern and Central European countries, this is not the situation we're looking at. This is a no-go zone where the government and the Egyptian public see eye to eye on what should happen, number one. Secondly, Gaza is from a humanitarian concern, has always featured high on Egypt's government priority as well as societal priority up until now, and in spite of the great deal of talk about the Rafah crossing. And I'm grateful that Dave outlined the fact that this is because sometimes you get confused in the media saying or hearing a lot of talk about the Rafah crossing and ignoring all other crossings, which are probably as instrumental in relieving and alleviating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But Egypt has been trying and keeping the Rafah crossing open on the Egyptian side, but facing a great deal of delays throughout the last months, a great deal of delays due to the Israeli security checks, which Dave has just referred to as well. From a civil society perspective, it's quite interesting to keep in mind that, if I'm not mistaken, according to recent estimates, almost two-thirds of all humanitarian aid which went into Gaza since October 8, 2023 up until today has come from Egyptian civil society sources. Even in regional comparison to more wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or the GCC countries, Gulf countries in general, Egypt has been ahead by far. Two-thirds of the humanitarian aid which went in has been collected by Egyptian civil society organization, and it gives you a sense of not only the government being interested, but civil society as well. Thirdly, Egypt has political concerns in Gaza as well. Egypt has come to tolerate Hamas' role in a de facto manner. The Egyptian government has a great deal of worries about what Hamas was doing in Gaza, but accepted a de facto role of Hamas as the administrator governor of Gaza since 2006, 2007, since Hamas performed its coup against the Palestinian National Authority. However, Egypt has always placed its bet on the Palestinian National Authority as the legitimate representation of the Palestinian people, and tried to manage Hamas in a way which would undermine the potential for escalation between Hamas and Israel throughout the last years. This time, we're seeing a bit of that, in fact, a great deal of mediation coming from Egypt and from Qatar, but where regional actors, including Egypt, took some time to realize was the fact that we are not going to return back to what existed prior to October 7. That the arrangement which was in place with a bit of toleration of Hamas on the Israeli side, as well as on different Arab sides, including Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, and elsewhere, was not going to be extended beyond October 7 and October 8 and the outbreak of the war. And up until now, everyone is struggling to find a credible alternative. And what that credible alternative could be? Could it be the PA, the Palestinian National Authority, returning back to Gaza which is a priority of the US administration, of different Arab governments, including the Egyptian government, but a priority that lacks facts to support it, because the PA is in such a weakened, even from a legitimacy perspective. If you look, Courtney, at recent public opinion trends in Palestine, support for the PA is at the lowest level ever since 2 decades ago. So, but everyone's struggling to figure out a way of governing Gaza without Hamas, or maybe with some remaining elements of the political leadership, not the political leadership, political cadre of Hamas, but away from of course that part of the movement engaged in violence and in terrorism. So these are questions yet to be responded to. But once again, to your key question on the humanitarian corridors, from a national security perspective, this was not even a point of discussion in Egypt.
Sure. Thank you. Tom, you spoke earlier about the role of international institutions like the UN. You gave us talk about the 2 UNs. I'd like now to zoom in on this idea of responsibility to protect, or R2P, which, thanks to your work, was adopted by the UN in 2005. And as you know, but this is for the audience, basically states that if a government isn't protecting its people from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, the international community has a right to intervene. We're not looking at all of these cases right now, but how do the principles of R2P apply in this case? And what do you think of, going back to the 2 UNs, the Security Council's handling of the situation in Gaza? And, is there a rift between principles and the impact that it can actually achieve? You're muted. Professor Weiss, you're muted.
Sorry, excuse me. I'm going to make a quick stab at this. I got several things wrapped together here. A disparity between lofty principles and performance is a pretty good summary for performance by many intergovernmental organizations, and actually by many governments, including for what passes for one in Washington, D.C. these days. You correctly characterize the responsibility to protect, which grew out of a report from an international commission, and the emerging norm that was approved by the 2005 World Summit. But it's not only governments, it's political authorities or guerrilla movements, actually. Any armed authority are unable to protect civilians or in fact are the cause of suffering that violates international humanitarian law. There is an international responsibility to act, not a right to act. There's an important distinction there, a responsibility to act. And the 4 crimes that are supposed to trigger this reaction are genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. We can argue about the exact parsing in Palestine at the moment, but most of the people on the front lines, and even members of the Biden administration, are hinting at using those terms to characterize what's going on. Certainly starvation as a weapon of war would be high on my list of crimes. But it's important to underline this distinction between right and responsibility. There's no obligation, there is no duty to act, but the idea here is the government should somehow feel embarrassed, frankly, to stand on the sidelines and not respond, which is, as our first question characterized, what the UN Security Council is doing most of the time, as it is doing in numerous other places, Sudan, Myanmar, Haiti, and the list goes on. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the 3 components of the responsibility to protect happen to be prevention, reaction, and rebuilding. There's a responsibility to prevent. We haven't done very well with that almost anywhere. And when they occur, there's a responsibility to act or react. And when both of those fail, which is actually what happens most of the time, one should look about putting the society back together again. I think the responsibility to protect in Gaza or almost anywhere else is a poster child for the disparity between principles and performance. But there's another important part of this conversation about responsibility versus right, which, because of how many horrible things were disguised by the H word, using humanitarian when it didn't apply, which of course put the hairs on end in much of the global South. But it seems to me that there's always been a problem. It's not that the responsibility to protect is a Trojan horse for Western imperialism. My worry is not that there's going to be too much humanitarian intervention or action, but actually too little, which is what we see. But the history of this movement, and I think it's important to think about this in terms of Gaza, it grew out of too little, too late, and some people thought too much too early, too little too late in Rwanda, where nothing happened while we watched 1 million people get slaughtered. And some argued that there was too much too soon in Kosovo because the UN, for the usual set of reasons, couldn't make a decision. There was a double Chinese-Russian veto. But the Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, asked a question in the General Assembly. He said, yeah, if there had been anything like a NATO-like force operational in 1994 in April, would anybody in this room have said they shouldn't have acted? There's a rather large silence in the General Assembly Hall to that rhetorical questions. But I think that Rwanda, alas, provides another model for Gaza. Nothing happened. And there was this, the spineless Security Council, including lots of people after the fact. Oh, we wish we'd done something earlier. But on the ground, the second UN, including the handful of soldiers and the Canadian force commander, Romeo Dallaire, did what they could. They just had no support. And so it seems to me that we'll see pretty much what we saw in Rwanda. We'll all be wringing our hands and saying, Joe, why didn't we do something earlier? And we'll call upon those humanitarians who are the better angels of our nature to respond. That refers to Lincoln's inaugural address in 1861. But I think for this particular situation, I refer to Alexander Pope, who talks about, I think humanitarians are the fools who rush in where angels fear to tread. And that's where we'll be, I hope, sooner rather than later, but we're certainly not there now.
Thank you, Tom. Speaking of the humanitarians that are willing to rush in where angels fear to tread, Dave, how are intervening NGOs, the NGOs that are coming and delivering aid, and I think you've given some, you've highlighted some great examples of very effective ones. How are they planning current and future aid missions to Gazans? And I'm going to throw a bunch of questions at you, and you can kind of take them in whichever order you think best. What do you expect from the Biden administration going forward? And how can safety be ensured, both of the aid workers, but also Gazans, avoiding scenarios like the mass casualty event in February, or the very highly publicized death of the World Central Kitchen workers?
Yeah. So the UN agencies, UNRWA, and that's a separate discussion that I think is going to have to, merit some thought, has 13,000 people in Gaza, and it has an infrastructure that allows it to operate thoroughly throughout Gaza Strip, kind of across all sectors. Whether or not they're effective or compromised or need reform is a separate story. Just in terms of the volume of people that they have 13,000. The US or the international NGOs have somewhere between 25 and 50 people on the ground. And they aren't going to scale. They're not going to go from 25 people to 2,500 people, in part because it just represents a structural corporate risk to the NGO, where they take on a lot of unknowns, and you never want to grow too fast anyway, anywhere, and certainly not in Gaza. So, can ANIRA go from 25 to 50, or Catholic Relief Services, go to 50 to 75? Yes. But they're not going to replace the infrastructure that you see out of the UN. The World Central Kitchen highlighted the absolute structural negligence of the deconfliction system. The deconfliction system is a trust-based verification system between, competent militaries and NGO actors to have safe passage to move people or goods from point A to point B. Typically, and there's always challenges with humanitarian actors getting killed in conflicts. Typically, the debate centers on whether or not the government or the military received the information. WFP will say, hey, I sent you information that the truck was moving in Yemen from here to here. You bombed it. The Saudis will say, you know what, never got it. You faxed it to the wrong fax number. And then there's a big discussion about the just the facts, okay, or the kind of the operations, the logistics. In this instance, Kogat, the Israeli civil administration, did get the information, and it wasn't conveyed to the Southern Command. And so this is a pretty fatal flaw. So that was deconfliction. It was the U.S. NGOs. What was the third one?
Biden administration response. And sort of what do you
Yeah,
expect?
so look, I mean, I was an Obama appointee. I ran global crises, the response to global crises around the world. I'm close to a lot of the people in the Biden administration. I've been extremely disappointed with USAID. I've been extremely disappointed with Samantha Power. It wasn't only until just the other day that she came out in a more forceful way. They don't have the relationships. I don't believe, meaning USAID, and anywhere below, say Blinken, Sullivan, and Biden, they don't have the relationships within the different structures and the countries to be able to push through kind of innovative ideas. They don't have a lot of on-the-ground experience. I was not happy with David Satterfield being the humanitarian envoy. He's a geopolitical ambassador, a strategist. He didn't know the operational elements of humanitarian work. He didn't know the crossings. So I thought that the U.S., left a lot to be desired. I thought the airdrops were ridiculous. This is all besides the point of the kind of cognitive dissonance of providing the air support and the airplanes and the bombs, and then providing the food. So setting aside the cognitive dissonance, just the operational aspects of it, I thought, left more than could be desired. So the real heroes in my mind right now are the ANIRAs, the World Central Kitchen, which is a new humanitarian actor that has demonstrated an enormous amount of innovation and agility. Those are the ones I've been the most impressed with.
Great, thank you. Tom.
May I
yes?
just say something, Courtney? I was just say that, to build on Dave's point, that in fact, Gaza is very different from other parts of the world, where in fact, the UN uses the small army of NGOs as subcontractors for money funneled through multilateral organizations. That is not at all the case, as you pointed out, in Gaza, where the UN is the predominant humanitarian, educational, and health actor.
That's a great, and those numbers, I think, really underscored that. So thank you. I'm going to get in one question. I realize this has been a long conversation, and I will get to Q&A. Amr, I'd like to talk to you about perspectives across the region. Over the years, I think there has been a calibration of government response to the Palestinian cause, also in response to that of the public. What are you seeing these days, and why is it important to understand the reactions of both the government and the public?
Right. Thank you so much, Courtney. Let me start by maybe taking you and my co-panelists and our attendees to the events of the last weekend, and to compare them quickly in terms of Arab public response to the memory of how Arab public responses were when the former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein fired some of his rockets in Israel's direction in 1991. Back then, some crowds were cheering the rocket firing. This time, we had no cheering anywhere in the region, which is an important point to keep in mind. We're no longer in the times where governments, no matter where they stand, progressive, reactionary, claiming to be supportive of the Palestinian cause or not claiming to be supportive of the Palestinian cause, where governments can, I mean, to put it in a blunt way, can cheat masses and convince them that they are doing their utmost to help out the Palestinian people facing starvation, facing potential famine, facing destruction and bloodshed in an unprecedented way. I mean, we're looking meanwhile at a death toll which exceeds the previous wars between Israel and Arab countries, which exceeds even the aftermath of 1948. In terms of the civilian death toll. So we're looking at a disastrous situation. And I believe it's important to take note of the fact that Arab public opinion responses are, to my mind, becoming more sort of well-informed. And this is not because of media. This is primarily because of social media. And the big role that social media has been playing in terms of informing the Arab public about the events on the ground. Number one. Secondly, traditionally speaking, and you're right, and Arab governments and their public have not been in sync or have not seen eye to eye with regard to Palestine throughout the last years. However, what we're seeing right now is the recreation of the public interest and awareness with regard to Palestine. This has not been the case in the last 10 years, at least, where due to internal events in many Arab countries related to democratic uprisings of 2011, to the second wave of democratic uprisings, 2017, 18, and 19, Arab public seem to be sort of consumed with internal events. What we're seeing right now is the recreation of interest, of wider regional interest in the cause of Palestine, at the end of considerable segments of Arab populations. I'm seeing finally an interesting trend which does not really expect Western governments, including the US, to do more, but places its hope on the Global South, in Global South governments, to stand up and try to contest some of the rights, legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. We are seeing, for example, and this is where masses were cheering, South Africa taking the Israeli government to the International Court of to the International Criminal Court. And other attempts by different countries in the Global South trying to push international organizations to examine allegations. And I'm going to say once again, allegations until confirmed. I'm not the one to prove them or not to prove them. Allegations of genocide, war crimes, and so on and so forth. The use of starvation, as was pointed out, as a tool in the current ongoing war since October of 2023. So these are the trends within the Arab public. I would label them in general as sort of a more fact-driven, information-driven take on what's happening, no longer easy to be moved around or pushed in different directions by an Islamic Republic in Iran claiming to be in favor of Palestine, or putting forward a religious discourse which no longer resonates in a similar way that it used to resonate a couple of years ago.
Thank you. And I think you bring up an interesting point, and this is one that one of our honorees at our upcoming gala just wrote about, Ishan Tharoor, is this idea that the rule of law and these international rules-based institutions, there's ownership among other countries, and that, you know, in an ideal world, it's seen as something that an instrument that all countries can use. So I'd like to turn to the Q&A now. I realize we went over time. Turning to you, Dave, first. We have a question here about how have the events of this past weekend, the retaliatory drones that were launched on Israel by Iran, how has that changed the humanitarian situation, if at all?
So I think there's a counterintuitive answer, which is the one that I hold. So on the one hand, you know, the Iranian strike and whatever form of Israeli retaliation occurs pushes down Gaza and the humanitarian assistance issues, you know, down the list of priorities. On the other hand, the famine is still happening. I do think the Israelis have opened up more since Biden kind of laid down the ultimatum. And I think Biden has more leverage now to continue this, given the U.S. support to Iran, to the Israelis on the Iranian attack. And so, at the end of the day, the humanitarian crisis isn't going away. The famine isn't going away yet. It may not be at the topmost of the minds of all the Middle East watchers, but it will soon turn back to Gaza. And I think that, in a sense, the Iranian attack helps require the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis owe the U.S. in a sense. So that means better outcomes in Gaza.
Right.
I'm not sure
Thank
if
you.
everybody will hold that view, but that's mine.
Thank you. Well, we asked you to hear your view, so
Yeah.
thank you. Amr, turning to you, we have a question here about how can regional powers more effectively contribute to resolving the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and are there specific roles you see for key players like Egypt and Qatar in facilitating aid and negotiating peace?
Right. I mean, Egypt, and thank you so much for the question. Egypt and Qatar have been making humanitarian aid a key component of their mediation efforts. I mean, you remember, Courtney, the first truce, first and only truce up until now signed between Hamas and the Israeli government had a key component of increasing volume and level and frequency of humanitarian aid going into Gaza. It did not result in alleviating the situation, which continues to be, as my co-panelists were outlining and you were outlining yourself, which continues to be extremely worrying. But it's always been a key component in mediation efforts, even recent mediation efforts that are yet to lead to a second truce or a ceasefire. Secondly, I believe that Arab countries, rich Gulf exporting, oil exporting Gulf countries, should be doing more, especially those countries which have good rapport with the Israeli government. The UAE has been trying to use its good rapport with the Israeli government to get more humanitarian aid in. And I believe if we stay away from the theatrics of airdrops and what's even in light of the Arab public opinion, sort of more rational attitude as of now is not sort of creating that great of a legitimacy input for Arab governments trying to showcase that they are supportive of Palestine. If they manage to negotiate using their good rapport, the UAE government with Israel, that would be a good asset to have. Saudi Arabia can do more with its symbolic weight in terms of organizing humanitarian aid coming not only from the Arab world, but from the Muslim majority countries as well. Ultimately, however, and the same goes for Turkey, by the way. So however, what I'm concerned about is that we are reaching a point or a level in terms of different imminent risks in Gaza where no one should expect a full alleviation of the problem anytime soon. We are going to live with a humanitarian crisis in Gaza for some time. I was recently reading estimates about the rebels and how long would it take and how much would it cost to remove them. And so, I mean, this was a wake-up call for me. I mean, this is a situation which will not be addressed in a few days or in a few weeks or even in a few months. This is going to be a medium-term issue that requires attention by regional actors as well as international actors.
Yes, yeah. Wonderful. And one quick follow-up before I go to you, Tom. We have a question here about what Iran is doing in terms of humanitarian aid. So we mentioned some of the Arab countries, Muslim majority countries. Right. What about Iran?
I'm actually not aware of anything.
You're not aware of anything. Okay.
Humanitarian aid, but I stand to be corrected.
Okay.
But once again, I believe it's interesting to monitor how wide segments of the Arab public have responded to the last weekend's events. And the cheering, which stayed away, is a good wake-up call for the Iranian government as well.
Dave, I see you're typing an answer. Is that one that you want to take?
No, look, the rubble. Amr mentioned the rubble. Very complicated, very expensive. It's toxic. It probably has bodies in it. It affects water and sanitation. It has unexploded ordinances, which everybody's going to have an opinion about their disposal. You can't do anything until you begin with the rubble. We're looking at and everything collapses as a result of the rubble challenge. I spent an enormous amount of time on rubble in 2014.
Thank you. And that one day when we get there, we would love to invite you back to actually talk about that particular challenge. Tom, we have a question about the Security Council. With it often at a deadlock on issues like Israel-Palestine, what realistic reforms could potentially enhance its responsiveness to modern conflicts? Then there's could non-charter modifications like expanding the use of the ARIA formula meetings or other procedural changes make the council more effective?
I think this is really diving into the weeds here for some of your listeners, I'm sure. The first part of the answer, I would say, fairly easy. I don't think that any reform is coming anytime soon. I've been saying that since I was a graduate student, and I've been right to date. Maybe I won't be right forever, but they're really, the politics of all change are raw. There are ways around that in some certain instances. For instance, I have the ARIA formula, which for people is having informal conversations outside of the Security Council, actually began in reference to the horrors in the former Yugoslavia, when the Venezuelan ambassador says, "Wait a minute, we've got an ICRC person, we've got a priest, and the ICRC, they're on the ground, and we're here in New York babbling away. We don't know anything. Why don't you bring them in?" And of course, governments didn't like that. So he said, "Well, I'll bring him to my place." So he started an informal conversation, which now has become part and parcel of what the Security Council does. Anytime anybody wants to talk about anything, it's outside in the ARIA, the so-called ARIA formula. I think this was a step in the right direction. Another step, I would say, in the right direction was forcing members of the Security Council who veto any resolution to have to parade in front of the General Assembly and defend such a decision and be subjected to questions from the audience. No government likes to answer embarrassing questions, and this isn't going to change the behavior of the Security Council, let's be serious, but it is a step in the direction of trying to hold the permanent members modestly more accountable for their behavior. But I don't, I see conversations about changing the Security Council, the members, the vetoes, the regional representative have been ongoing for as long as I've been in this business, which is a long time. And the only change was to add a few members in 1966. And that's about all we're going to see, actually.
Thank you. We have a question here, Dave. I'll put this to you. How can U.S. weapon sales to Israel be stalled or leveraged in order to impose U.S. influence in this critical humanitarian crisis? So what is your take on that proposal?
I think it's unlikely, particularly after the Iranian strike. I think if anything, it's going to be fast-tracked. Practically, the president, the State Department, they can certify, Congress could object. I don't think any of that's going to happen.
All right, there we go. Okay. And then we have a question here about what does a response even look like? And are we really being able to address root causes? And so, Amr, I'm going to kind of fold that question into a larger one. So originally, when we were planning this discussion, at first we were going to have it on sort of what does a post-war Gaza look like? And then we realized that we were not at the moment to have that conversation. But I think having had the conversation that we just had, it is interesting to talk about what kind of response could be, and where do we go from here? And so I'd love to get your thoughts on what things could look like down the road.
This is an extremely difficult question. Extremely difficult because we on the Palestinian side, to start with, we do not have clarity on who represents the Palestinian people as of now. It's an issue up for contestation, and that needs to be looked at as such. I mean, we have the PA on the one hand with with extremely low approval rates. Not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank even more. We have Hamas, which is not going to be tolerated regionally or internationally as an actor. We have a PLO, a Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has been out of touch with developments in the Palestinian society in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, as well as in diaspora communities throughout the last years. And it does take a Palestinian national dialogue or a Palestinian national conversation to result in some clarity on where they would like to go. I mean, which way are they going? I mean, there are massive, substantial contradictions between what the PA is putting forward and what Hamas is putting forward, and you need to know where the majority of Palestinians stand. And it's not done, Courtney, by simply saying, well, let's have elections tomorrow, or let's have some fresh blood into the Palestinian Authority the day after tomorrow. I mean, these are quick fixes, which I believe no one really believes could yield the expected and the wished for change. So the number one question is, we do not know who can govern Gaza on the Palestinian side the day after. This is yet to be responded to. Secondly, on the Israeli side, it's quite a fluid political scene as well. I mean, we're looking at a right-wing government, far right-wing government, and we do have some centrist elements. I'm not sure where they stand on difficult questions regarding the day after and the governance of Gaza, and whether it's Gaza plus West Bank, or Gaza only, and what kind of security arrangement they would like to have. And therefore, I'm afraid when I look at the Israeli and Palestinian side, that what we are slipping to de facto is an Israeli reoccupation of the Gaza Strip, with some buffer zones here and there, with some incursions from the security forces of the Israeli security forces, permanent incursions into Gaza, similar to what they are doing in the West Bank. And this would result, from a regional perspective, in the creation of an enclave of instability, very close to Egypt, very critical for Jordan, and very critical from an Israeli security perspective as well, and quite destructive from a national aspiration perspective of the Palestinians. So I don't have a good answer to this question.
I don't think anyone has a good answer. It's a tough question. In the few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to just cycle through each of you very quickly, sort of do a quick answer from the perspective of the areas in which you work. What's the one thing that you would most like to see, or you think could be most effective at, potentially moving the needle right now in addressing the humanitarian crisis? So, Dave, I'll start with you.
Well, you added the clause addressing the humanitarian crisis. So I was going to say more broadly, I think the U.S. should recognize a state of Palestine. An op-ed in the New York Times about 2 months ago. I don't think the fact that there's a lot of unresolved questions, including borders, matter. There's lots of examples in history where we decided that we were going to recognize the aspirations of a people, including the Israelis in 1948, where the borders weren't set and the kind of the formation of the government wasn't solidified. So I think that if the U.S. did that, or at least put in track something in the UN that they would not object to, I think it would change the regional dynamics in a very positive way. I think it would give the, maybe not for the Israelis, and it would give the Palestinians some legitimacy for their aspirations that are outside kind of the Hamas radical Islamist destructive trend that could disrupt Egypt and Jordan and the rest of the region.
Thank you. Amr?
I agree with Dave. I would add to it, besides the recognition of a Palestinian state, on the Palestinian side, to launch a national dialogue, to set their priorities away from the radical, militant, violent, terrorist discourse, which has dominated the scene in the last years.
I like that idea.
And Tom, you're
I think I'm going to be less highfalutin and hope that the humanitarian issues which have disappeared actually come back on the agenda. The killing of those 6 expatriates and 1 local, the dangers involved with humanitarians, I think people don't understand what work these folks do. We used to have lament 80 or 90 deaths a year among humanitarians. In 2023, there were 260. In Gaza, we've seen 200, including virtually all locals until the World Kitchen killing. So I think that people who undoubtedly will receive lots of envelopes in their mail this week should not be hesitant to do what they can to help out what's going to be a very long-term problem of humanitarian aid, let alone moving on to anything like development.
Note. Thank you all for the work that you do and for being here today. It's a tricky and difficult topic, and I appreciate your participation. Just a few really quick housekeeping notes. Let me see, I think we're doing our next briefing. Our gala, right, is coming up, and that's in less than 2 weeks. And so this is a fundraiser for Network 2020, so we can keep having conversations like these and reach people around the world. We do encourage you to come and attend if you're in New York. Our next event is with Dr. Green, and we're looking at the role of Australia in the South. And that's a virtual member-only event. And I believe we have one other event scheduled potentially. Nope, not yet. But keep an eye on our website. And thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.